What is this? What are we doing here? Perhaps if you've caught us teasing this series over the last 18 months or so, you already have an idea, but for everyone else, you can be forgiven for not knowing the first thing about the Venetian Republic. A little bit of context. We'd briefly outlined this before in our Crete episodes, but it is 2017, just got married, pretty happy with that result, and I was fairly adamant when Jen asked where I'd like to go for honeymoon, go to Crete. In particular, see the Minoan palaces. So sure enough, off we go, and it was 10 of the most idyllic, euphoric and exciting days of our entire lives. However, interesting twist, before we actually got to the Minoan stuff, we started off in the west of the island in a town called Chania. So we're sitting by the waterfront, just absolutely gobsmacked at how good life is, and utterly entranced by this amazing place. And you start asking questions like, what's the deal with this historic waterfront? And it soon becomes apparent that, yeah, by and large, this is built by the Venetians. The Venetians, the people of Venice? Isn't that a little far from here? Like, what are they doing here? I mean, I was a bit of a history nerd at that point, nowhere near the degree I am now, but I had not heard about this at all. And then we headed east and stayed in Heraklion, and sure enough we saw Knossos and some other places, but once again, Heraklion and all the Venetian stuff ended up really stealing the show. A year later we're off travelling again, and it's almost comical, pretty much the exact same thing plays out. I'd wanted to see Mycenae, and Jen was mainly sorting out itineraries at this point, and suggested, well, yeah, there's this town nearby called Nafplio, and people reckon that's quite nice, let's stay there. So, the Bronze Age remains of Mycenae, amazing bucket list stuff, but yet again, the utterly jaw-dropping Venetian historical setting of Nafplio ends up being the unintended highlight of the whole thing. And I don't remember exactly, but while sitting by the waterfront one evening, I think I made some sort of offhand joke to the effect of, well, hey, maybe we can just go visit all the Venetian outposts, and then, you know, once we've filled out all the spots on that punch card, we can go to Venice itself and collect our free cappuccino. Yeah, ha 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 ha. And, well, having started by laughing that off as a ridiculous idea, by autumn of that year, we had a few days in Pula in Croatia, and then the following Christmas, I made Jen this. This is a map I adapted somewhat from, well, actually it's not some precious ancient resource, it's just an old atlas, but we've spent the last few years visiting some of the most incredible places you'll find anywhere in Europe, and perhaps more importantly, in destinations you can get to generally for under 50 quid a head, otherwise this whole thing would have been entirely impossible for us. So I cannot tell you just how good it is to finally be sharing this with you. Now, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I don't want to front load all of it into this opening episode, otherwise we'll never get anything done. Maybe the biggest problem with the series is probably getting people to actually care about this. Most of the structures you'll see are from an early modern period, mostly the 15 to the 1700s. This is not a historical period most people have as much interest in. You know, you make a video about the Romans or the Vikings and you just get all the clicks. And even just some battlements and crenellations in the thumbnail will get you a modest audience, but almost all of these fortresses are built to repel cannon fire, and it's just an uphill climb all the way to convince the wider public that these places really are as exciting as I keep alluding to. So, we decided that for this first episode, it made sense to start at the place we started, on Crete, to explain just why the Venetian Republic is worth getting excited about and is worth spending nearly 6 years now travelling and obsessing over to produce these episodes. And Crete is a phenomenal showcase of just how spectacular the Venetians could build when they really got going. For now, we're going to go on a tour of the various remains of the Venetians left on the island of Crete, and we'll start in the northwestern tip. Running perpendicular to the distinctive long, thin shape of Crete east to west, two mountain chains send these huge peninsulas soaring miles off its northern coast. If you sail up the northeastern side and round the northern tip of this, the Gramvousa Peninsula, you're greeted not only by even more astonishing coastline with an unrealistically gorgeous beach, but by two islands, both called Gramvousa. And if you peer hard enough at the southern island, the outline of a fortress comes into view. Funny story, The footage you're seeing here is from our second visit back in 2021, and I'd spent a good spell filming this island excitedly like, yes, I recognize this from last time, I'd recognize that distinctive shape anyway, yes, I know exactly what I'm doing. Before realizing that this is the similar but entirely separate Agria Gramvousa. From the east, it looks so similar to Imeri Gramvousa, which is hidden behind it with the, actual fort. When you do land on the correct island, the fortress itself also plays a funny trick with the landscape. Almost as soon as you step onto the beach, the fortress disappears from view, obscured by the rock face that looms above you. It's hardly a 5-minute stroll to the top, put it that way. A recurring theme you'll see with Venetian fortifications is they seem determined to place their gigantic fortresses up the most extreme slopes they could possibly get away with. I mean, goodness knows how many times Jen and I have exchanged a look while standing at the bottom of a slope that may take up to an hour to climb in the 35 to 40 degree heat the Mediterranean climate will throw at you in the summer months. The fortress of Gramvousa itself is not in the best shape. When you actually get through the gates, the inside is mainly rough scrub and whatever low thorny bushes can survive on this exposed plateau. The most obvious landmark to investigate first is the ruined chapel in the middle, though it's a rather forlorn sight inside, filled with rubble and occasional graffiti. Then you can take in a loose lap of the perimeter walls, very impressive in size, though somewhat crumbling from 3 centuries of neglect. Gramvousa was built between around 1579 and 1584, and we'll have a chance to talk about artillery fortresses and particularly Venetian architecture and how it works in due course, but for now, just notice the angular ins and outs. Gramvousa is not the quintessential fort layout, as the designers were clearly having to work with the terrain, but the distinctive angular wall shape with this line here, which is called the cordon. This isn't an innovation unique to the Venetians specifically, but it becomes a familiar hallmark as you start following the Venetians around the Mediterranean. A welcome sight that you're probably in the right place. There's a good chance that if you're there at all on Gramvousa, you've probably come on one of the several boat excursions you can take from the port of Kissamos, and these don't allow you very much time to explore the place before you have to leave again. The guides like to talk up the island's history of piracy, and when you're trying to sell days out to the tourists, pirate islands are good copy. But from our perspective, what makes this island interesting, it was one of the last holdouts of the Venetian Republic in the area. To jump to the end of the story, spoiler alert.
Spoilers from history.
The main island of Crete was lost to the Ottomans after the city of Candia, now Heraklion, fell to the second longest siege in recorded history, an astonishing 21-year struggle until the surrender in 1669. However, the Republic still held garrisons in 3 tiny islets for a few more decades. Gramvousa was one of those, a last holdout of the Venetian military until, on the 6th of December 1691, during the Mauryan War, another major conflict between the Ottomans and the Venetians, the captain of the fort betrayed his command and surrendered the fortress to the Ottomans, reputedly for a large bribe. Now, with all of that, there's definitely a story worth telling there, right? Thing is, there is so much for us to get through. We still have the whole 120 kilometers of Crete to cover, and we're only in the top left-hand corner. Plus, while I'm trying my hardest to get you all excited about this, I know that people's mileage with the in-depth history is going to vary. So here's how this is going to work. These episodes mainly explore the locations and the amazing fortifications and other architecture the Venetians left behind. Then before long, in the future, we're going to upload some long-form podcast-style episodes which dive into the history more. So for anyone who wants to get the in-depth history, keep an eye out for those, or if you're watching this in the playlist, they should be near the end. Okay, well, we've got to move along. The next major Venetian location along the coast is the town of Chania. Now, this is the place where the obsession with the Venetians first started, and look, I can't recommend highly enough that you visit. I mean, go and watch the Chania episode to hear me gush about this even more. Just absorbing the vibe itself without a single line of history is still amazing, but I'd like to give you a quick tour of the Venetian elements of the town. The one thing you cannot get away from in Chania is the lighthouse. It's the centerpiece of the view from pretty much wherever you stand. It's a beautiful outline that's very hard to take your eyes off. It's frequently described as the Venetian lighthouse, so it pains me to tell you that what you see today is only partially Venetian. It's likely the initial Venetian structure was not as lofty. It may have been close to this one you can see on Kefalonia. The base of it is apparently still the original Venetian, but the current structure was built by the Egyptian forces between 1824 and 1832, who were there to prop up the Ottoman rule on the island, which was faltering. A lot of the Venetian sites we'll see may have been updated, altered, or generally co-opted by later occupants. The Venetian Republic was formally ended by Napoleon in 1797.
Spoilers from history.
This episode we've just got all the spoilers, but, well, yeah, I wasn't going to be able to keep that a secret for long. You can't help but notice that the Republic of Venice doesn't have a seat at the UN. Anyway, I'm trying to point out the relative age of structures and whether they've been altered, but as I keep saying, we've got a lot to cover and I'm not going to be able to go into every single detail and nuance, which is going to leave a vacuum for the well actually crowd to fill in the comments. And won't that be fun for all of us? Well, circling around the harbour wall and the fort partway down, a bit like the lighthouse, those have been restored and looking quite modern and neat nowadays. At the end is a ruined guardhouse. Then, around the other side, you have a series of surviving Venetian arsenale. These are the warehouse buildings that were used to build and repair ships, and they're rather beautiful, followed by the Grand Arsenal with its particularly spectacular front facade. If you're in a former Venetian town, keep an eye out for the arsenale. I mean, a lot haven't survived, but as you'll start to see, there's a certain set of hallmarks that the Venetians were here in a particular town, and they quickly become familiar. Okay, so if you duck just past the waterfront in the other direction, you'll find the outer walls of Chania. Now, these are very impressive. They extend around 2 kilometers around the old town. However absurd it may seem now that I've pointed my camera at them, it's very possible to miss them if you're not on the lookout. My 2017 self mostly did. That's because the fabric of the city gets built up around them, and in the case of the southern side, most of it has been entirely demolished. I mean, just wait till we get to Heraklion. Those walls get concealed by all sorts. As mentioned, these walls are designed to repel cannon fire. Now, we're going to need to take a deep dive on some of the architectural conventions before too long, but the basic idea is rather than a medieval wall, which, you can punch through with a middling to large size gunpowder weapon, if your walls are basically massive chunks of earth that are just lined with stones, you can fire at that sucker all you like, but pretty much all you're doing is chipping away at the facing stones. The earth isn't going anywhere. Best case scenario, you're just creating a slope of rubble, which is, a little easier to storm, but at best, it'll cost you heavily in lives if you try. And most artillery forts are not just one single line of defense. The bastions are generally built to cover each other and make the whole system as painful to assault as possible. Now, for these to work, you need a large open area, essentially so that your enemies don't have any cover, and you'll have a clear field of fire to shred anyone who tries to get close. So modern city designers are faced with these huge, chunky fortifications, which are labour-intensive to try and dismantle, but also have massive, barren spaces in front of them. It's perhaps unsurprising then that pretty much all of these get turned into parking space. I am spending my whole life trying to film the Venetian fortifications while having to frame the parked cars out of shot. Right, where were we? Well, first of all, there's what's left of the Sabbionara rampart with the sea crashing against it. Then there's been a hole torn in the walls here, which then extends south for an unbroken stretch. Another hole torn for the road, and then this huge triangular bastion, which is pretty well camouflaged by the city if you're not looking out for it. At this point, the southern walls are for the most part lost, replaced by later buildings, but you can pick up the trail as you head west. You can see a bit of the southwestern walls just through the buildings and, more car parking space. There's a curious mound here, which is called the Bastion of Lando, but other than being pretty much permanently closed to visitors, it's also not in great shape, needing a series of pretty hefty structures just to keep the crumbling walls up. Then, perhaps the most impressive of all the walls is the western section. Now, I know I was complaining about the walls becoming car parks. This building site is perhaps a step too far in the opposite direction. But it is nice to have the walls clearly visible, and, hey, there's a path along the top of the wall, so that's a start. At the end, we have the San Salvatore Bastion, and then just beyond that, you have the Fiacas Fortress, which defends the entrance to the harbour. This was actually a later addition to the main fortification works done in the 1500s. This was built in 1629 and allowed a chain to be drawn across the harbour to block access. So, yeah, it's a lot. So we zipped around that pretty quickly, so let's have a recap with a supercut going counterclockwise. Most of what you're seeing was part of a major program of works on Crete in response to the increased Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean, begun in 1536 under the architect Michel San Micheli. Funnily enough, these are not Chania's only set of fortifications. If you don't go down some specific streets, you wouldn't even see them. They're pretty ruinous and flanked by derelict buildings, such that it's not immediately apparent what you're looking at. These are the Byzantine walls that surround most of the ancient part of the city. This is the part of town where you can find the ruins of Kydonia, the Minoan settlement on what would later become Chania. The Byzantine walls are built on a Hellenistic foundation, but you can see they've been bodged together in something of an act of desperation, just pulling material from any building they could get their hands on in the 500s and 600s AD just to get the town defended. They encircle a comparatively small area at the slight rise which makes the high point in the town, but you can see that these would have been woefully inadequate to defend both the town, that had expanded beyond the limits of the Acropolis, but also against the cannonballs of the Ottoman bombards. So, that was Chania. There's one more thing to attend to before we move down the coast to the next major Venetian town. I mentioned that Gramvousa was one of the last 3 holdouts of the Venetian forces on the island. It was Gramvousa in the west. In the east, the island of Spinalonga, which is now a very popular destination for tourists, but the third is in the harbour at Suda, which is the main commercial port of Chania. This small island fortress held out against the Ottomans even after Chania itself fell. After assaulting the small fortress didn't work, the Ottomans reputedly tried to pull a Gramvousa by bribing some of the officers to leave, but unlike Gramvousa, it didn't work. Now, annoyingly, and believe me, I looked and I only found one company that maybe had trips near here, and even then, this was just at the tail end of a rather expensive full day of other beaches. So try as we might, we didn't manage to get to Suda to see it for ourselves. And hey, look, these episodes would have been ready a lot sooner if I could just let things go. We could have just done a few episodes on, hey, so the Venetians were pretty cool, and here's a few of the places we've been. Instead, the mission creep of discovering even more Venetian fortresses all along the Adriatic and into the Aegean has ballooned the scope of these episodes to an absurd degree, and then multiply that by the other series we've got on the go with the same problem. I don't know what it is, but knowing I missed something significant, it just takes all my self-control not to be right back on the EasyJet website like, we gotta go back to the island. That was a lost reference. I feel like I have to point that out now, as it feels like we're rapidly getting to the point where no one remembers that show, but shh, don't tell my wife I said that. Okay, leaving the Chania prefecture behind and heading down the coast, the next major town and the next major Venetian location is Rethymno. Rethymno has a distinct and different vibe to Chania, but still competes on equal footing with its beauty and historical mystique. As we already mentioned, if you want a bit more on the town and the area in general, watch our Rethymno travel episode. Once again, we've got a beautiful lighthouse that's, not a Venetian build either. Venetian foundation, sure, but otherwise it's another Egyptian build, so we'll move along. There's a smattering of Venetian fragments around the town, but the particular highlights themselves are not in the greatest shape. So the Raimondi fountain, built in 1626 and named after the Venetian governor of the same name, definitely eye-catching, but noticeably incomplete. The dome that used to cover it now gone. The gate of Porta Guara, while looking a little bit worse wear, dates back to the Venetian town, though you can see it's been simultaneously preserved, but not very sympathetically with the surrounding structures. The Narazza Mosque in the square began as a church built during the Venetian years by an Augustinian order and then later remodeled by the Ottomans, which is pretty apparent from the domes and, yes, minaret. Other than these specific go-to points, you can have an amazing time just getting lost in the tight back streets which are packed with historical buildings. Of course, the star of the show here is the spectacular Venetian fort that occupies the northwest of the town. There had previously been a Byzantine fortress here, but on a far smaller scale. It's interesting, as rather than encircling the town, as they did in both Chania and Heraklion, the Venetian architects in the 1500s opted to build a fortress that could house the entire town in a new settlement. This was after a devastating raid in 1571, and as this was also the year that Cyprus fell, the Venetians realised that Crete would have to be far better fortified. The fortress was constructed in just 7 years, finishing in around 1580. But this is a trend that pops up again and again with Venetian engineering projects. They'll attempt some gravity-defying mega-project, and then it'll remain embarrassingly vacant as the local population remain reticent to move in for one reason or another. And yes, in this case, the fortress did not turn out to be large enough to house the entire town, who remained largely outside its walls. It's still huge though, 1,300 meters all the way round, and to get a good look at it, it takes about an hour, and that was making relative haste as our day got progressively hotter. Now, there's not a huge amount to say about each bastion and feature, so instead I will outsource a lap of this to the Supercut. The real problem is that despite how impressive it appears, it's still quite a bit smaller than similar fortresses of the time. Not so much in circumference, but just in height. It's one thing on the seaward side where the cliffs make it considerably more formidable, but the gate, for example, beautiful, but not all that tall. Compared to Heraclean's walls, or most other defensive works we'll see, it's rather diminutive. And sure enough, when the Ottomans assaulted Crete, they laid siege in 1646, and the fort, now housing the population of the town as best it could, didn't do well. It was lacking food and ammunition. Admittedly, that's more of a lack of preparation than strictly an architectural flaw, but the writing was on the wall and disease broke out, and so eventually they surrendered to the Ottomans just a month and a half later in November. Right, well, before we go, final segment of this episode, Lion Watch. Okay, this is going to take some explaining. The Venetians adopted St. Mark as their patron saint, and even going as far as stealing his corpse. More like stealing a corpse from Alexandria and hoping it was St. Mark. And look, I've been a Christian and in church since year dot. I've got a fair handle on what is and isn't in the Bible. The whole thing that St. Mark equals a lion, that is some apocryphal nonsense added way after. I am not going to bother to try and untangle that. But the Venetians sure were in a hurry to put the, quote, Lion of St. Mark on everything. Winged lion. Of course the lion has wings. Why wouldn't it? But as if this wasn't just bonkers enough already, the Venetians became a byword for wealth and high culture and exquisite architecture. Architecture we're going to spend the next long time unpacking. And they could not resist stamping their logo everywhere. But the level of artistry here is, I'm sorry. The more of these you see, the more it looks like they outsourced the design to a competition at a local primary school. If you want to see some of the least anatomically accurate lions, this is the Venetians' whole thing. They are all about lions and fancy architecture and fancy sculpture, and yet this is how they drew lions. The masons actually signed off on these and said, yeah, great job, guys. You really nailed that lion. I assume. I've probably not even seen one. Let's go home. This doesn't even look faintly ridiculous. So, at the end of each episode, we'll be looking at the various lions that pop up around the Republic and admiring their beauty and anatomical accuracy. It's like the Renaissance never even happened here. Okay, so beginning at Gramvousa. It's actually easy to miss as just another chunk of masonry, but there's this lion lying near the entrance. It's a bit worse for wear, but somewhat resembles a seal with a perm. The other main one I found in the Chania area was this rather weathered specimen on the seaward side of this bastion at the northeast corner of the harbour. There were fewer than expected around Rethymno. There's this fragment which appears to have been recovered on the floor of this ruined church on the high street. They've done a reasonable job with the body, at least. Apparently, these mascarons on the Raimondi fountain are supposed to be lions. Even weathered, I can scarcely think of anything less lion-shaped. In a lot of places, you can see the niches where the lion would have been. It would have most likely been above every gateway, perhaps here, for example, in this empty niche. Look, we'll have more and funnier examples in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, hope you've enjoyed this first instalment. Please pass this around, as it's so much harder to get people enthused about all things Venetian. Most people just don't know this is even there. Meanwhile, the music you've been hearing in the background is ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it all on bandcamp.com. If you want to support us, that is the place to do it. Otherwise, you know how to make our day. Drop a subscribe and a comment. Follow us on the social medias. All of those things. We'll be back very soon.